Thank you for joining me tonight. Tonight, we want to take on the topic and we want to speak candidly, having a nice conversation with some of the great minds that are in my life. Two of the greatest minds, at least, I believe, in the UK, in the kingdom of God. A friend of mine, Bishop Wayne Malcolm and David Shosanya, and our new guest as well, a young man who I've been hearing lots about since being introduced to his discipline, his background in terms of his medical profession, Dr. Garrick Wilson. And so we're excited about exposing him to this, to my world anyway, and hearing his phenomenal mind, a young man who is really making great strides in his particular profession. And it's just wonderful for us to hear about all what he's doing in the midst of our topic and our discussion tonight. So I'm going to bring my guests on. So let's bring them on. Let's bring them on, team. My team, I'm hands-free. My laptop, my computer is controlled by my team. So they're going to bring my guests on right now. I see GK, I see iGlobal, which I guess must mean Bishop Malcolm, and Garrick is here, and David Shosanya. Hey, Garrick, David, bless you all. Can you all hear me?
Yeah. Good evening.
And we're just waiting for Bishop to click on his video. Garrick, so that we can see him as well. Welcome to you all. Welcome. Hey, Bishop in the house.
Hey, good people.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to read out just a little bit of a bio on these individuals because I think it's worth us talking about their pedigree, their credibility, their outstanding history, which will hopefully feed into us getting wisdom to get a great destiny. I'll talk about, first of all, Bishop Wayne Malcolm is online. Bishop Wayne Malcolm, some of you are familiar with Bishop Malcolm. Bishop Malcolm and me go back many, many years in our spiritual connection and also our organizational connection with our church foundation. Bishop Malcolm, however, in my opinion, is one of the greatest minds in the kingdom of God, not just in the UK. We tend to lean in the kingdom of God in church towards the, oftentimes towards America or towards Africa, towards the Caribbean. But I think this is one of the greatest minds, and I'm glad he's my friend. One of the greatest minds in the kingdom of God today, one of the greatest preachers, revelatory insight into scripture. But Bishop Wayne Malcolm is the senior pastor of the ICANN Community Church. He's affectionately known as the Business Bishop. You can catch him on Instagram on Bishop Malcolm, and you can hear him do all of his motivational speaking, his life coaching, just a great mind when it comes to the fusion between faith and the business world, entrepreneurial world. Great man of God. Many of you have heard of him before, but that's Bishop Wayne Malcolm. We also have with us my great friend as well, Reverend David Shosanya. I'm blessed, man. I got some great friends. I got Bishop Malcolm and David Shosanya as my friends. I'm pleased. He's a theologian. He's the co-founder, many of you may not know, the co-founder of Street Pastors, David Shosanya. And he continues to work with government and advises key organizations on strategic engagement, especially as it regards to faith, crime, and race issues. And we have a new guest on with us, a great young man of God, and also a phenomenal mind in his particular discipline, Dr. Garrick Wilson. And I'm hoping we're going to hear even more about this young man. He is really a doctor and a scientist whose discipline is in epidemiology and infectious diseases. He currently works with Imperial College Hospital, which is one of London's leading research hospitals, studying the virus that we're encountering right now and pursuing also the development of a vaccine. So he comes with great pedigree and great discipline and great background, and we're excited about the conversation tonight. Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome.
Hey.
Well, I hope you've all had a great day so far. We're going to have a public discussion. Of course, we're on Facebook, it's social media, and we want to be able to engage the audience as well, those who have joined the conversation. We're going to have some Q&A, hopefully at the end. I don't know how much time we'll have left, but we'll definitely try and have some kind of Q&A at the end, guys. So if you have questions, please do this. Put question, literally question, the word question, in capital letters in the comments, then followed by a colon, then try and articulate your question, not in tongues, Pentecostals, trying to articulate the question in plain, clear, easy English so that my team can grab the questions and throw them at me to pose to the panel. Tonight, You guys are used to hearing a lot from me. All the viewers, you're used to hearing a lot from me on my Wisdom Wednesdays. But tonight, I'm going to try and play more of a host and a stirrer of the conversation, although I might put my little 22 pence worth into the conversation as well. But listen, here's what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about Christ, of course, because we are Christ followers. If you're not a Christ follower, I invite you to be a Christ follower if you're watching on here. We are talking about Christ. We're talking about conspiracy. And we're talking, of course, about color, because this is the latest thing in terms of race that's starting to emanate in terms of the issues surrounding the context of this COVID-19 virus. And so that's really where we're going to be intertwining, overlapping, talking around in terms of those 3 C's in the context of the COVID situation. But I want to let's open by talking, of course, about Christ, because Christ is premium, Christ is premier, Christ is the King of our lives. And I've made a couple of notes here just to try and keep me on track, because there's so much we can talk about. And I'm believing that this is going to be the first of many. I'll have other guests on as well that will help try and cover some of these topics as we go through this lockdown season. But let's talk about Christ. Let's talk about theology first of all. I want to begin by talking about the theology of suffering as it relates to Christ and our understanding of the theology of suffering. There are some believers who are propagating and really, I guess, focusing primarily on the fact that, Jesus is a healer. And yet in the midst of Jesus being a healer, we are seeing some Christ followers and others succumbing to death in the midst of this horrific, diabolical virus that's swimming and floating around the world right now. Loved ones, people I love, people some of you love, who have lost their lives to this. So let's talk about bringing some clarity to this issue of what is often in the 21st century Western church, at the very least. I would dare to say, and I'm going to speak candidly. The advert says we're going to speak candidly, so let me speak candidly, even though I'm risking getting emailed and complaints probably. But nonetheless, the fact is we often have a bad theology as it relates to suffering. I know you and I, Bishop Malcolm, in our other times, private times talking, we've talked about this issue before, how the church tends to have what I call a caricature perspective on faith. A caricature I use as a metaphor juxtaposed to portrait. A caricature versus a portrait. If you look at a picture, you have a caricature picture, you have a portrait picture. A portrait picture tends to be balanced. It's a balanced interpretation of the subject matter, whether it be a person or a building. It's a portrait. Whereas a caricature, we all know, usually accentuates or elongates a particular aspect of the character. So the chin will be bigger, the ears will be bigger, and it maximizes one aspect rather than keeping a balanced portrait. And as it results to faith, I would dare say that when it comes to our faith, we in the Western world oftentimes have a caricature gospel, a caricature faith, where we have accentuated one aspect of it rather than giving a balanced perspective on the gospel and on faith. And a balanced perspective on faith and the gospel, to me, would also include a theology on suffering instead of always talking about prosperity, blessing, breakthrough. That's the theme of the 21st century Western church, but I think that is a caricature theme. I'm going to ask you to speak into that. I'm going to let you go first, Reverend David, then I'm going to go to Bishop, then we'll come to Garrick. Yes, Reverend Dave, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I tell you what strikes me immediately. I agree with you that often our perspective on faith, particularly suffering, is a caricature. I think that's because of our everyday life experiences. There's a famous, well-known American theologian by the name of Anthony Pinn, and he talks about Black people and their experience. And he says what we search for is what he calls complex subjectivity. Right. That's the ability to maintain a core sense of who we are in the midst of an environment where we're consistently contesting for our own authenticity, our own agency, our own legitimacy. So for us, suffering is not a theology, it's an experience. It's an everyday life experience. So when we then have the additional suffering of illness, or the additional suffering of death, or the additional suffering of whatever it is, it actually compounds our own sense of self-depreciation, that actually we don't feel that we belong and that we're fully human. And so it's not that we don't believe it's that we experience social isolation, social exclusion as a form of an attack on our humanity. So when all these different types of suffering come our way, it actually just is on top of the suffering that we already have as everyday Black people living in a society where we feel we're not accepted and we're socially isolated. And so I'm not excusing the caricature, but I can understand it because we need a God who is really redemptive, who should bring us out of that suffering. And that includes physical illness, psychological illness, emotional illnesses, and also some of the social illnesses that we face in our lives on a day-to-day basis. So there's got to be some corrective action, but I think often the imbalance comes from the extreme experiences, cumulative experiences every day of being isolated and feeling dehumanized and feeling less than. And then when this other thing comes on top, it becomes a problem for us. So I agree with you. Christ calls us to suffer with him. It just becomes problematic when suffering is already the definition of your life.
I love it. I love it. I remember you reminded me of a discussion I had way back when I was in Bible seminary with my lecturer she was my Old Testament lecturer, and we had a big dispute over the fact that she was propagating the fact that suffering is part of, almost she was inferring, is part of your proof of your Christianity, because to really embody Christ and to really prove that you are, I guess the Christ follower, in terms of you have to really identify with his suffering. And I was arguing back, saying to her, and it caused a big problem in the class. I think I nearly got kicked out of the class at the time because I was a big mouth at certain times. And it was caused a problem because I was saying to her that much of her interpretation and her theology was based on her background and reading theologians who all came from wealth, who all came from privileged backgrounds. And so their desire to experience Christ came through wanting to suffer, wanting to travel to the outer parts of Uzabemweki, and I've just made that place up, to sleep on a floor that would give them splinters while they were serving the less fortunate. For them, that was the embodiment of Christ. Whereas I said to her, well, what about those who are already on the floor? Yeah. What about those people? For them to really experience Christ, they need a God who can lift them out of their suffering. So I love your point. Now I want to move to Bishop real quick. Bishop, give us your perspective, sir.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Pastor Mike, for hosting this great conversation, and to my fellow panelists who were just absolutely eminent. So I think that COVID-19 has exposed a deficiency in our theology, particularly in the West. And it has exposed a discrepancy between our idea of suffering and our ideas of success. And I like what David said, that actually it's understandable why we gravitated in pendulum style towards the theology of success, because we are a people who have historically emerged through great suffering. Our story as Africans in the Western Hemisphere is a turbulent story, to say the least. And we have come through slavery, we have come through segregation, we have fought for our civil rights, our human rights, and for justice, and we are still fighting today. And so gravitating almost in pendulum style towards a theology that presents God as the savior from all of these situations is highly understandable. However, at some point, the pendulum has to swing and find a balance in an even place. And the even place is the fact that the Bible tells the story. You know, our faith heroes are all people who endured hardness by faith. Yeah. They endured difficulty by faith, which tells me that faith is not just a way I get things from God, but faith is a way that I get through things by God. And so whether it's the patriarchs of Israel, the prophets, whether it's the people of Israel, the apostles, the New Testament church, their experience of suffering, whether it was at the hands of oppressive regimes and governments, whether it was sickness, and just to contextualize this, Elijah was taken to heaven with a chariot of fire, and we sing, swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. But Elisha died of a sickness, and Elisha's anointing was the double portion. He prayed for the double portion. He worked twice as many documented miracles, and yet he died of a sickness. And so the idea that an anointed person could die of a sickness is so foreign and so alien to us, and it has to be revisited, because biblically we have examples of anointed people who did that. And then I guess at the heart of our faith is the cross, and you can't get past the cross. Well, what we have here is the Son of God, who is the Son in whom the Father is well pleased. He's spotless and he's sinless, and yet he is exposed to the violence and the brutality of the cross. And yet this was all part of a plan. It was part of a plan. So I think it's important that we see our sufferings as part of a plan, and realize that actually, there's another word for suffering. I suppose suffering that is involuntary, that's imposed upon you by society, is something you have to endure. But there's another side to it, which is sacrifice. And sacrifice is more so a decision that you make to endure hardship for a greater cause and for a greater glory. So I think there has to be, I think we would do well to revisit the theology of suffering, and people wouldn't be so discombobulated by these unexplainables, because of course, if you live in that pendulum extreme, that God always heals, God always this, he always does that, then this whole season makes no sense to you whatsoever. And you're perhaps questioning God, questioning your faith, questioning its validity, when actually you need to read the Bible and realize that people of faith endure hardness by faith. They don't just get things by faith, they get through things by faith.
Yeah.
And that's the dimension of faith that I think we are coming back to in terms of the pendulum swinging.
So the situation is sobering us into having to bring balance. That's where we're coming from here. Well, let me come to you, Garrick. Now, Garrick, I want to come to you on two counts. Number one, you're a young man. I'd like to believe I am as well, but I'm sure you're younger than me. Bishop has his hands up. He's a believer.
I'm young.
Bishop's believing as well. Faith, faith without works is dead, though. We've got to show ourselves that we can really do it. But the fact is, Garrick, you're a young man, and I'll tell you why I'm mentioning that. And you're also a medical practitioner. You're in the medical field as a Christ follower. Two things: the youngster stuff, the young man stuff. I've found, now I pastor what is considered, I guess, a relatively large church in the context of London. I'm a pastor, I'm a community engager. I found that when it comes to talking to people about this topic of suffering, it tends to be the younger who get more confused or more perplexed as it relates to balancing their faith with suffering. Why would God allow this to happen to me? Why am I going through this? I hear that kind of notion, that inference more from youngsters or youngers, I would call them, I should say, than more mature people. I want you to talk into that. I want you to talk into why you think those reasons are and what you think can be done to help bring better balance to younger people. And then also, I'm going to give you some more. I'm going to give you a double whammy here. As a medical practitioner, how do you approach, a medical practitioner and a Christian, how do you approach suffering from the perspective of being somebody who's supposed to understand how medical things work, how people work, but also when you see people not being healed? How do you bring that into the context of your educational understanding from a medical perspective? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate being on this panel. You guys are way ahead of me, so I'll try and keep up with you as much as possible. Thank you, Pastor Mike. A couple of things you said, but just before I touch on that, I just want to go back to a couple of the points that were raised about this complex subjectivity where suffering is a constant experience. And I want to shift that and say perhaps because it is constant, we have normalized it in some ways. And because we have normalized it, we have also practiced this kind of faith. It's the Psalm 91 faith that says, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High God shall be protected from everything possible. And as a result, there's a sense of diminished responsibility whereby we do not take responsibility anymore when it comes to things like social distancing, etc., because we're just protected from the virus. And I think any faith that limits personal responsibility is just not right for me. And so I think that there needs to be an element of responsibility there as well. Going on to your question about our young people see this, young men especially, compared to the older generation. You know, I was raised in church with my grandma, and they for them, life was suffering. And for them, it was always looking forward to heaven. There was a redemptive hope. There was that triumph, and everything was about, I need to make it in, I need to make it home safely. And if I have to suffer to get there, that's what it will take. I think what is different now, especially with my peers, is this idea that faith brings an element of, it's all about success. How do I succeed in life? I will be protected. My goals will be achieved, and I can do and achieve as much as I want to do by the grace of God. And so when that is the context which individuals are coming at it from, and then something like this happens, it throws them off. And it causes one to search their faith, search their theology, and ask, okay, who is this God? Who is this God that I've been taught about? And I perhaps sometimes think that may be to do with the fact that maybe we're living somebody else's perspective on who God is.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the word that and I'm not saying anything is wrong with the word that was taught to us or the preachings that we hear, but aside to that or outside of that, do we take the time to sit down, search the text for ourselves, have a disciplined prayer life, and also get that relationship with God, which is personal, and it is not dependent on whether or not things are going good and bad. It's just the treasure of knowing that we are connected to him. And I think this situation in particular that has locked us indoors, I think it's causing us to face ourselves. Maybe for the first time, some of us are meeting ourselves, but for the first time, maybe some of us young people are meeting God for the first time. Who is this God? I'm not able to go out to church. I'm not able to have my weekly worship experiences as is the norm. But here I am in my home, and it's the first time that I'm having to contend with this God that I've heard so much about, but perhaps I've not had the opportunity to sit down with him and just to really have that close time with him. So that's my perspective on that. On the point about suffering as it relates to my profession. So I'm a scientist. And of course, scientists believe in things that can be tested and then proven and so on and so forth. So you bring the context of faith in, you can't test that in a lab setting. And therefore, that's a difficult thing to do. But when you see suffering and you see and talk about people being healed, as you said, in relation to my faith, I totally believe that God is a healer. He's a redemptive God. There are things that science cannot explain. So, for example, we know that if individuals are going through worship experiences and you do a scan of their brains, part of the brains that normally don't become active or show any form of activity, which we don't know what it does to this day, suddenly become active. So there's something there, higher cognitive sense or perspective that's being activated. So I think from my perspective, I take it with a pinch of salt in the sense that we don't know everything as scientists. We are limited in our perspective, and where science doesn't fit those gaps, faith for me, it's not even gap, where scientists can't fill that vast void. Faith makes the difference there.
Yeah, love it. Listen, everybody who's watching, if this is blessing you already, I need you to light your page up. Fire emojis. I need you to share this. I want everybody to be blessed. I've been trying to put my Wisdom Wednesdays on, as you've noticed, people, not just to don't jump into theology, but I'm trying to give people help during this lockdown season. This quarantine moment has been a difficult time for many people, and all the Facebook lives we've been doing, and you can go back through my page and look at the ones we've done on marriage during lockdown, the ones we've done on mental health, the ones we've done on finance to try and help people out and get some wisdom from some of that stuff during our Wisdom Wednesdays. And I hope you're going to glean some more wisdom tonight. I'm already excited because I love what I'm hearing, and hopefully we're going to dig a little deeper in a little while. You know, gentlemen, one of the things we forget when it comes to the Bible is that there are Bible passages that talks about, you know, to live is Christ, to die is gain. And we tend to focus on just the living and the prosperity side of things. I want to just stay on that for a little while, especially as it results to suffering and the finality of suffering in death. So what happens? What has a person been healed? What happens when a person does not get healed? How do you explain that in terms of our theology, especially when we're surrounded right now? We're going to be coming out of this, and there's going to be many people who are going to have experienced the death of loved ones. Where do you guys come from in terms of your perspective of explaining how could God have allowed this to happen? Because that's often the question that's swimming through unbelievers' mind, or when I say unbelievers, people who believe in God but haven't necessarily accepted Christ. And also there are some Christians, it swims through their minds when they pray for somebody's healing and then the person doesn't get healed. in terms of the way that they expect. And I've phrased that particularly in that way so that we can see where, I guess, sometimes we're short in our thought process on whether the person was healed or not. How do you juxtapose the God who is a healer, the God who helps you through suffering, with the God who didn't seem to answer your prayer for the person to live? Talk to us about that. Reverend Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Pastor Mike. I don't find that a problem, because I think we have to step back one step a bit. And I think the problem is entitlement.
Yeah.
That actually, as human beings, we think that we're entitled to full health. We think we're entitled to full knowledge. We think we're entitled to full insight. What I've learned, my dad died from a congenital heart failure.
Yeah.
He had a stroke when he was 38. He never recovered. He was paralyzed on his left-hand side. My brother died of schizophrenia in a psychiatric hospital. In fact, he was murdered. And my mum died of cancer. I can look back on every one of those situations and bless God that healing wasn't the outcome. Because the retrospective gaze that comes from journeying forward from the wreckage and allowing God to reconfigure the damage and to give me perspective and not feel that I have to have an answer from God.
Yeah.
Because a simple scenario, my brother would never go to church, but when he went to Nigeria, he got ill. He asked them to take him to a church. They took him to a church. He gave his life to Christ. And then a few days later, he was dead. He would never have gone to church in the UK. So when I heard that he died, I was complaining and saying to God, are you alive? What are you doing? And then when I got his goods back from Nigeria, there was a letter signed in there with his signature and a time and a date telling us when he gave his life to Christ. So I looked at that and I thought to myself, in the wreckage, there was something redemptive, but I had to journey forward into the future in order to look back and see what God was doing, rather than to demand that God is not who I project that he should be, simply because he doesn't do what I ask him to do. One guy says that God is the absolute mystery behind all reality and absolute reality behind all mystery. And then he says, how glibly we Christians speak about God, as if systematic theology and biblical revelation has reduced the infinite deity to finite comprehension. And we're often in danger of doing that. We're trying to reduce God into finite comprehension. And part of suffering is to break us out of that constraining of God and to just allow him to be as wild as he wants to be, if I could use that language.
Dave, I love it, love it, love it, love it. Listen, if you didn't light the page up with what was just presented there, I don't know what's wrong with you, because that was a perspective from experience and from general insight also. Bishop, come on now, let's tag team.
Well, I'm not sure about any tag team right here. I'm still chewing. I'm still chewing from David. I mean, oh my word! I want to revisit this video and take notes, because that was just profound. I don't think there's any way to improve on what David said, but I think that it is important to put life in perspective. You know, our experience in the world, from the womb to the tomb, however long that is, whether it's 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, or 5 years or 5 minutes, it is a moment in eternity. It is a moment in eternity. And so from God's perspective and from other perspectives, you know, we are not we are not as entitled as we would like to feel.
Yeah.
And usually the sense of entitlement really comes from a disconnection with eternity, with our sense of eternity, as if everything that a person will ever be and can ever be must happen in this form and in this flesh. Whereas biblically, there is beyond. There is beyond. And yes, we can't define it in absolute terms. So we call it the sweet by and by. We call it heaven. We call it eternity. But God is so creative and so colorful and so crazy, as David said, or wild, wild, you know. There is that wild side that I have no doubt that whatever life is beyond this plane, it is infinitely more exciting, adventurous, and rewarding, to the point that I don't think we could pay those who had left to come back. And often while eulogizing and sermonizing, I draw a parallel between birth and death, just how similar they are. Because if you could interview a baby that is being born, the baby would probably say, I don't like this. I don't want to do this. This is horrible. Join me in prayer, please, to stop this happening. Let's all fast and pray and just reverse this process. Because right now, everything I have come to know, trust, believe in, rely on is leaving me. It's collapsing. It's falling apart. And I am being thrust violently into something I do not know. And I'm afraid. Would you please pray for me and help me? But on the other side of that experience, there is a family rejoicing and celebrating. And I think in some ways there is the parallel that actually birth and death are related in that sense. We are thrust into something we don't know, but we have hope. And biblically, the other side is infinitely better than this. Now, that's not something that we're going to harp on about, and because people will forget that death is an enemy. It really was never the plan of God for us, but it is now part of our experience, and we have to put the experience into perspective so that we're not, we grieve, we mourn. The Bible says we grieve, but not as others who have no hope. And therefore there has to be a difference that faith makes to this particular conversation.
You go ahead, Bishop. You finish.
Yeah. So that's not to say that it's easy or that this makes it any easier. The last thing you want to hear is a philosophical perspective on what's happening. But as time goes on, we're phenomenally resilient as humans, and we come to terms with it. And actually, in the sweet by and by, said the songwriter, we will understand it, and we'll agree that God did the right thing at the right time.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Love it. Love it. I'm going to come to you in a minute, Garrick. I need everybody who's online, if this is blessing you, if you know somebody, listen, these are the conversations many of our members want us to be having. And that's why I wanted to do this. I know a lot of pastors don't necessarily engage this in a massive platform, but I wanted to do this because I think it will bless people. And let me know if I'm right. Let me know if I'm right. I want to see some likes or loves, if anything, at least Dr. Garrick or Reverend David or Bishop has said has blessed you so far. And make sure you're sharing this, because so as many people as possible need to be in on this tonight. They need to go to bed having heard a conversation that brought revelation and hopefully will bring elevation to people's faith and understanding. One of the things we tend to fail, just before I come to you, Dr. Wilson, one of the things we forget to remember is that this is probably the most biblically illiterate generation there ever has been. And when I say that, that's not a pejorative insult. That's just a state of fact. And this is the generation that cherry picks scriptures, because we forget, going back to the same question, we forget the Bible tells us, man. The Bible tells us it's appointed unto man what? Once to die. And so if death is, as you just said, Bishop, is a part of our reality, then it's strange how we, especially as Christ followers, don't really have a balanced view as to the fact that it is a part of the process of life. Dr. Wilson, I want you to speak into the same question, and then we're going to move to the next topic. Go ahead.
So a little over a year ago, my mom, she passed away from a heart condition, a degenerative heart condition. And for 2 entire years leading up to that, we prayed. And we prayed with all sincerity and with all faith. And we believe, and in fact, we fasted as well. And we got, my church and a few other people to join that. And constantly we were praying for her. I don't think there was a day that passed in those 2 years that there weren't offerings of prayer. And these were multiple times of the day. And we believed in everything that we were taught. By his stripes, we are healed. If you ask of him, he will give it unto you. No good thing will the Father withhold from them who love him. We believed everything. And yet there was this paradox, because the more we prayed, the worse she got.
Wow.
At one point, the results came through and she had had 84 mini heart attacks over a period of a month or so. And we were praying and we were believing and we were fasting, and things just got worse and worse and worse and worse. And that caused me to go into a place where I literally questioned everything that I believed. And I recall, the night when I was told she's literally got days to live. And again, you get to that place where you begin to question, is it the time to accept the inevitable? Or is it the time to pray more earnestly? And if I'm to stop praying now and just accept that this is what's going to happen, does that mean I no longer have faith, or that my faith is not big enough? And it was a really hard crossroads to be at. Where do you stop and where do you accept? Where do you accept or where do you continue? And I recall the evening before she passed, and we were all around her bedside. And in that moment, one of the things that she said to me was, because I dropped everything at one point, left my job and just run home and said, okay, I just want to look after you, Mom. And she was looking at me, and I didn't know this at the time, but she was looking at me consistently worried out of her mind. And whilst we were praying for physical or bodily healing, what she was praying for was that her children who she's left behind would be okay.
Wow.
And when I was at her bedside in those last moments, one of the things she pointed out was the fact that now that I see that you are settled, because eventually there came a point of peace.
Yeah.
I am healed because my prayer is being answered. And all this time you've been praying for healing and others have been praying for healing. This is what healing looks like to me. When you're no longer seemingly going out of your mind, worried to stress about what's going to happen and the inevitable, now I am healed. And that's why, when we ask about healing for individuals, we need to get a clearer perspective as to what that looks like, rather than these thoughts that we may have conceived in our minds about it. And that's something I want to say. And just looking back at that, having gone ahead now with perspective, I wouldn't want my mom to be around in this situation. She would be put in one of those high-risk categories of getting COVID-19. I personally wouldn't even be allowed to be around her. And I think that would have been far more worse, especially if on top of a heart condition, the diagnosis came out that she'd contracted COVID-19 as well. So just looking back, I believe that God in his infinite grace knows all things in his infinite wisdom, and he does all things in the right time, in the right way.
I love that perspective. I love it. And I think sometimes our theological understanding, if we study the Bible in its original language, sometimes our understanding of what God's definitions are sometimes slightly different, well, oftentimes very different to our perspectives and our understanding. I mean, the Greek word sozo, Greek word sozo has connections to the word salvation, and it also has connections to the word healing. And so is our healing always on this side, or is it the healing actually taking place by virtue of the fact that we've crossed over into the fullness of our salvation? So we're praying to God and asking him for healing, just because he doesn't answer the question, answer the prayer in the way we need him to answer it, doesn't always mean that he has not answered it. And so I think sometimes we need to widen our perspective as well, based on our understanding of scripture. Listen, the time's running away and there is so much to talk about, guys. This is crazy. We're going to have to do this again, gentlemen. We have to talk about this again. But listen, I want to move to the topic of still under Christ, but then we're going to try and merge it into doing color and conspiracy. Christ, if you're talking about Jesus, we're talking about God, we're talking about the gospel, we're talking about God's character. God is a God of justice and social justice. And what we're seeing happening as a result of this disease that they're calling the disease that's unified us is actually seems to be the disease that's dividing us, in context of how people are being affected by the disease, especially with the latest statistics coming out talking about how Black and ethnic minority groups, Black and Asians in particular, are seemingly more susceptible to the effects of COVID-19 and are passing and are being diagnosed and are just in a real situation in terms of the disparity of the figures that are coming out. I want us to talk about that, but I also want us to talk about that and connect it to some of the conspiracies that are coming out. Now, I know one of the conspiracies seems to already have been quashed because the individual who was really propagating that, it's turned out that that wasn't necessarily his role in the particular company, etc. But there's also conspiracies saying that this is a disease that's in particular been designed to attack here we go, black people. There's also the conspirators, the antithesis to that conspiracy that says that it's a disease that cannot affect black people, which seems to be crazy in the context of what we're seeing with the statistics. But then they're saying that it's not affecting black people or shouldn't affect black people, because when you consider, if you simply look at Africa or the Caribbean, the statistics don't seem to marry up with what we're seeing in America and the United Kingdom. So I want you to talk about this. I'm going to work the other way around. I'm going to begin with my doctor. I'm going to begin with Dr. Wilson. You've seen the virus, you've studied the virus, your expertise comes in epidemiology, you're dealing with infectious diseases, you work in an outstanding research hospital that's looking for the vaccine. Talk to us about what you found with the virus. Talk to us about some of these conspiracies. Talk to us about the medical evidence and support that contravenes and contradicts some of the nonsense that we can be hearing nowadays. Go ahead.
So just for context, I was trained in infectious diseases and cancer in particular. Yeah. And I've worked on a number of viruses, including hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, a few of the respiratory viruses as well. With this particular virus, first of all, I need to say that it is a virus. And one of the way we confirm, or scientists would confirm what a virus is, if there is a suspected infectious agent going about in the population, you isolate those individuals, first of all, who are showing symptoms of that. You take a sample from them and you take that into the lab. And to prove that it is an infectious agent, you need to be able to infect something else with it to show signs of infection. So you take the sample that is being taken, you apply it. In this case, in the labs, we have what we call cell cultures, which are living human cells that you then challenge with the virus and see how they respond. If they show signs of infections, and there are many different ways we can look at that, then indeed it is an infectious agent. Another thing you then do from that is you take those cells and you can really look at them down a microscope. In this particular instance, when we're looking at viruses, because they're so small, they're 1,000 times smaller than a bacteria, for example, you have to use something we call electron microscopy, which enables you to see much more microscopic elements.
Electron microscopy. Okay, go ahead.
And that's different to your normal conventional microscopy, which just basically uses light. So when we're talking about electron microscopy, we're thinking of much more complex engineering and physics that is being applied. And that will enable you to see tiny microscopic elements. And you look down that, you see microscopic elements. So if you watch the news reports or some images on the TV, you'll see these almost spherical structures with these little spikes that are coming off them. And really, that's not exaggerated. That's what a virus, or that's what some viruses look like. And
that's where this crown thing comes from.
Absolutely. So these spikes on it are really crowns, and that's where we get the name corona from. Yeah. And these spikes are what we call glycoproteins. And what they do is they're like a key that attaches to a cell, which is the lock now. And their job is basically to find a way from the outside of that cell into that cell. And those cells in particular are in your upper airways. And that's why people who get this infection tends to have, lung conditions and breathing difficulties and so on and so forth. So as I was saying, when you saw those images on the TV, you see those images on the TV, that's really what it looks like. We can make them colorful so they can come out a bit clearer, but that's really what it looks like. That's just one way to prove the virus exists. So first of all, it needs to show sign of infection when you take it from somebody showing symptoms and you challenge it in the lab using cells. It needs to look like a virus when you look at it down the microscope. And the third thing that we can do is we can look at its genetic makeup. So when we're talking about viruses now, there is this big particular debate out there as to whether or not they're alive or dead when they're outside a living host. So a virus needs to attach itself to a host in order to show any form of activity whatsoever. And so when we're talking about a virus, we're thinking of a small particle, as I said, which has got an envelope or a membrane around it. And inside that membrane is what we call a nucleus. And inside that nucleus is where the genetic material is. We can extract that genetic material. We can probe it and look at it. And we can tell that it looks different to other living species that we know and fits the category of other viruses. So this particular virus now that we call COVID-19 belongs to the family of coronaviruses. And this is a family of viruses which is normally prevalent in animals. So we're thinking pigs, camels, and bats, for example. And what they do, if they get into the human population, and it's very, very difficult for them to do that. If they do get in the human population, they cause mild to moderate respiratory illnesses. So we've seen this before in the case of SARS. We've also seen this before in the case of MERS. These are two viruses that are from the same coronavirus family. This one, however, is just completely new. It's never been seen in the human population before. And unlike the others, it tends to be sticking around. It seems to be much more infectious, which means it persists much quicker. Not only that, it lands on surfaces and it stays alive on surfaces for much longer. Normally, when a virus lands on a surface, it would literally die in a few hours. This is hanging around for days. And that's why the guidance went out about good hygiene practices, washing your hands, etc. Yeah. So these are just some of the ways we know that there's a virus. And my colleagues and I, we've seen this. We've looked at the genetic data. We've looked at the microscopy data. And not only that, it's not just us. This or samples from people who've been infected have been sent to various centers around the country, and even in fact across the globe, who have independently verified that there is an infectious agent lurking about.
Lord Jesus, have mercy.
Jesus,
that was
preach.
Thank you. So,
that was great.
I could have listened to it all night, brother. I've forgotten what I asked. I'm so ensconced in all of the erudition and the perspicacity that you're coming out with that I've forgotten completely what I asked you. But all I know is I gleaned a lot of knowledge right there. But what I want you to speak into, especially, is the controversy issue. There's the issue of people saying that, if you're melanated, then it's not going to affect you as badly. Some people saying if you're not melanated, it will affect you. All kinds of controversies coming out. One of the latest ones is saying, if you just take, I've read this from people who claim to have PhDs. If you just take some vitamin D, then you're good. You can roll out. You don't need to practice social isolation. And then we had the whole radiation thing coming up. I'm going to come back to you on that, Garrick. Bishop, speak into this for us. We've lost your sound, Bishop. We've lost your sound. Can't hear you, Bishop.
Any sound?
Much better. Excellent.
Fantastic. So first of all, Garrett, I could genuinely listen to you for the entire night. That was an education, and that's the sort of education that we are needing today, because I guess as a community, as minorities, the BAME community, we have lots and lots of historic good reason to be distrusting of government and its various agencies. We're just on the back of the Windrush scandal. We don't have that much confidence as a whole in government and its departments. And this, I think, makes us somewhat susceptible to conspiracy theories. And when it comes to a conspiracy theory, I just feel like this pandemic is too young. It's too young, and it's at such an early stage that there's more and more we're going to find out about its behavior and its nature as we go along. Yeah. The problem is, at the beginning stage, we are more likely as a community to buy into the dissemination and participate in the dissemination of misinformation. Yeah. And it has to be misinformation because everything is too young to have such conclusions. So in the early stages, my phone was bombarded with videos, audios, articles of so-called experts who had already figured the whole thing out.
The barbershop experts, right?
Barbershop experts.
The people from the Mandem University.
Mandem University. That was one. But the thing is, these videos came with really good English, all of the words that I'm hearing tonight. Okay. And they were so well put together because there is, I suppose, a pretty strong anti-globalization conspiracy movement that will invest in high quality videos, etc. So these videos were just going around everywhere, but I begin to notice who was consuming the misinformation. and it was people that were already distrusting of government, of authority, of government agencies, and so forth. And then I began to think about this as a preacher, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a microbiologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, and I bow to that wisdom. But I'm a preacher, and I know that the tree is known by its fruit.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I want to know what the truth is behind a piece of information, what I tend to do is I ask myself a simple question. What is this information? If I believe it, what is it telling me to do? Right. In other words, if I believe this, what am I going to do? And so what I began to realize is that a lot of the misinformation was leading people to further transmit the virus, to not practice social distancing, to not take the government guidelines, and to practice irresponsibility. Yeah. And then they were sharing this like wildfire. And then what we began to see was people saying, yeah, I know we're supposed to lock down, but I'm still linking the man them. I'm still going to link my girl. I'm still going to do this. I'm still going to do that, because it's just a conspiracy anyway. It's radiation. It's this, it's that, it's the other. And I realized that the fruit of the misinformation was death. And then I began, as we began to lose people, okay, because
they were believing the issue.
As we began to lose people, people began to get infected and die, who had believed that it was okay for them to link this one, link that one, do this. And I was seeing it was different ages. You know, there were young men, there were young women, there were middle-aged people. As we began to see this, my attitude changed. You know, it changed. Yeah. Initially, it was a talking point. It was a debating point. It was like, you know, okay, let me prove that your radiation theory is flawed, right? Yeah. And then it became a holy anger as I realized that this was killing people.
Yeah.
This was killing people.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Pastor friends of ours, pastor friends.
It was killing people. I realized there is a virus. There is contagion. It is highly infectious. I began to see entire families coughing their lungs out when I would call them, and no one else on the street but that particular family. I begin to see our young people. I begin to get phone calls. Bishop, I just lost my mother. Now I've lost my father. Now I've lost my uncle. I began to see this, and I got angry about the dissemination of misinformation. So what I begin to do, people send me a video, they literally began to think, oh, I must have sent this to the wrong number. Because I sent them back a message that didn't sound like a preacher.
It didn't sound like the bishop. It didn't sound like the bishop.
Never send me this demonic trash again. If you send me another one, you're blocked. And then I'd give a little explanation as to, just to throw a doubt in your mind.
Yeah.
And the whole point was, if you're wrong, you're going to kill people by disseminating this information. You're going to kill people. And if you can live with that, then carry on sending the videos, carry on sending the text messages. But if you can't live with that, you obviously haven't lost anyone yet.
Yeah.
If you can't live with that, you know, don't send misinformation that will lead people to transmit the virus. And I'm not saying it's the only reason why we're overrepresented in the death toll, but it is one of the reasons that we don't trust the information that is being given to us by the authorities. And we're convinced that this is just another way of controlling us, breaching our privacy, infecting us with marks of the beast, putting microchips inside of us. And we've got all of that in our head. And that is one of the reasons. It's definitely not I don't think it's the main reason. I think that poverty, the difficulties of lockdown, how impossible lockdown is for some communities is probably the majority of it. But that's something I'm pretty angry about.
Absolutely, Bishop. I'm joining you with that righteous indignation. Listen, I know it's late, everybody. I want you to let me know if you want me to carry on. I'm a pastor, I'm a preacher, so I can talk all night. Most of us here are hard workers. We're tired. But if you want me to carry on, I need you to sense, I need to see at least 200 love emojis or like emojis and fire symbols. Just light the whole page up, and that will let me know I can carry on maybe for another few minutes, because we wanted to also do a few Q&A. I know some of you have been sending questions, but we still haven't covered as much as we want to. And I can see already we're going to need a part 2. But if you want me to carry on, I need to see the fire. Until I see, I'm a Pentecostal, I need to see the fire. Let me see the fire, and then that will let me know to carry on. Otherwise, I'm going to shut it down. You got like 5 seconds to show the fire. Otherwise, I'm gone, guys. I know there's a little delay. So let me see if there's any fire going to appear. If I see fire, I'll carry on. If not, we're going to close this for tonight. Okay. All right. So we've been given the green light just to continue for a while. So here we go. You know, the anti-disestablishmentarianism and the anti-establishment and the not believing, not wanting to trust institutions and all of this kind of stuff, we understand oftentimes that's justified based on how certain people have been treated. But Dave, Reverend David, I need you to speak some wisdom into this in terms of how we can have a balanced approach with holding the authorities to account, yet accepting much of the information that is actually going to keep us alive.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of distinctions, and I think that I've got a slightly different. I hold everything. The science I can't contest because I don't have the qualifications to. The points that Bishop articulated, I fully understand and endorse. But I think we've got to be careful when it comes to talking about conspiracy theories, because I think oftentimes we dismiss them as if they don't exist. Let me give you a typical example. If I sent a video around or a voice note around saying there's some scientists in France that are planning to go and inject Africans with, or do an experiment, and everybody will say to me, "Hey, don't be so, don't overstate the point."
Yeah.
But what we saw on television was 2 eminent scientists
considering
they were on television saying we should go and test in Africa. Absolutely. Where there isn't the same proportion of coronavirus as there is in the UK. Yeah. So the question is, why would you test a virus or a vaccine in an environment where it doesn't exist, when in your own environment, people are dying disproportionately? Right. The same people that you want to... So let me say something about, because I've got a very different view on conspiracy theories. The Bible is full of conspiracies. Jesus is the subject of a conspiracy and the object of a conspiracy. So when he died, we were told that soldiers were paid in order to say that his body was stolen.
Right. That's the Easter story.
Sorry?
That's the Easter story. Absolutely.
Right. So therefore he's the subject of a conspiracy. But he also becomes the object of a conspiracy because people try to deny that he ever existed. That's what we've seen since the resurrection. So what I'm saying, when it comes to conspiracy theories, we have to nuance the conversation, I think, a bit. Because what we've seen through history is that the more time unfolds and the more we get disclosure, whether it's government documents or whether it's investigative journalism, what we tend to find is that we get disclosures that we wouldn't see until we go into the future. So I believe in social distancing. I don't believe that there should be dissemination, intentional dissemination of misinformation. But let me say something. Every heresy is built on truth, but there's a distortion of that truth. Montanism in the early church, Gnosticism, Marcionism, all of these doctrines are all based on truth that is distorted. And if we dismiss misinformation without taking what's in there, some information, and testing the spirit of that information and testing the trajectory of the truth of that information, I think we can be just as guilty as those people that dismiss the information without interrogating whether it's valid or not. And so I want to be a bit more nuanced in terms of how we approach some of this stuff, because history has told us, if this was the cigarette crisis, everybody knows cigarette manufacturers told everybody there's absolutely nothing wrong with cigarettes. What we discovered X amount of years later is that there was pure problems with cigarettes. We can, I don't want to take up all the, but we can go on and on. So I think part of what we have as a church is two things. First, as a church, we have a prophetic responsibility to discern what is going on. Absolutely. And to ask probing questions.
Yeah.
Secondly, those of us, or all of us, there's a very famous writer called Noam Chomsky. He wrote an article called The Responsibility of the Intellectual. And he said the responsibility of the intellectual is not to luxuriate in academic ivory towers, but it's to interrogate the story in order to isolate truth and lies and to perpetuate that to society. That is the prophetic imperative that we're called to as a church, to look for truth, even where it might be mixed up with falsehood, to extract that truth and to have a perspective that projects that truth into the world. And I think we have to have a more nuanced view of conspiracy theories if we're going to do that. So let me say one last thing.
Yeah.
If I told you there was a lady in a palace who was going to get married to a king, but her uncle was outside and he told me that they were trying to kill all that lady's relatives, the argument will probably be that she's so close to the king that it's unlikely that the king would allow her relatives to be killed. And it will probably be dismissed as some degree of a conspiracy theory until you read it in the Bible, in the book of Esther. And all of a sudden, retrospectively, what's a conspiracy theory becomes an objective empirical truth, a fact. And I think we just need to nuance it a bit. That's my personal perspective.
Bishop, come back in. Come on, Bishop.
Yeah, I want to come back in.
And then I'm going to come to Dr. Wilson with a question. So get your medical mind ready, Dr. Wilson. I'm coming for you. Go on, Bishop.
But this is really a question for Reverend David, who is a living legend and a genius, right? But this is a question for you. Do you feel that the church has exercised its prophetic responsibility to interrogate the story and to isolate truth from error? Or is there not simply a vacuum into which many souls are perishing? So the point, and when I say a vacuum, in other words, is there enough clarity coming out from those with prophetic responsibility to help a generation that's not particularly intellectual to isolate truth from? So like you, I have a history, I have a well-documented history in believing that conspiracies happen, right? That's the history of the world. It's not new. In this particular case, we are responding fundamentally to the crisis, the immediate emergency. From the immediate emergency, what we know is that there is a highly infectious, contagious disease that is being transmitted from people to people. Like one person said to me, the virus isn't spreading. She said, people are spreading it. Yeah. So nicely put, quite succinct. We now then are dealing with an immediate crisis that requires clarity from the clergy about what we should do now.
Yes.
Then when you have slowed the spread of the infection, undoubtedly the interrogation of the story to isolate truth from fiction or truth from lies, we have a prophetic responsibility to do that. My response was to, we're 5 weeks into a lockdown, right? And we're dealing with an emergency. How do you feel we should respond now to this current emergency?
Very simple. I think we should take seriously the government recommendations around social distancing, around hygiene practices, and then we should do what we've done today, which is to get scientists like Dr. Garrick to articulate a perspective. But what we're also talking about tonight at the moment, which you mustn't forget, is color and disproportionality.
Yeah.
And that is set within the context of research that was commissioned by Theresa May, that was headed up by Lord Woolley, to explore issues of disproportionality affecting non-white communities in the UK. That's the race disparity audit in number 10. And what it showed unequivocally is that structural racism had such a detrimental effect on African and Caribbean Black people, or BAME people, in every aspect of their life that it had to be taken seriously by the government and money had to be put into it. So we can't disassociate the structural inequalities of our society and the tendency to blame or pathologize particular communities, to demonize particular communities. So at the moment, people saying we don't have an answer for why Black people are dying.
Yeah.
But they're saying we've got underlying issues around hypertension, diabetes. So they're saying, hey, we haven't got an answer, but this is what's likely to be the answer. And by the time you try to correct what's likely to be the answer, it's already been accepted as the given definition for what is actually the problem. So if we have a responsibility to be quiet, so do people in authority to say we have no inquiry at the moment. Otherwise, what will happen is that the people who have a natural proclivity to think that we're less than human and to think that we're less than responsible, either for hygiene practices or our personal health, therefore our deficit in terms of well-being around diabetes and so on, will then project onto us and blame us for our own deaths, when actually all the evidence shows it's about structural racism that has systemically had a negative effect on our communities. That's where the prophetic mandate comes. I don't want to take up too much time.
No, that's phenomenal. Both you and Bishop are helping to shape some context here. And I think when you look at the statistics, if you look at, I mean, coming back to the race, is it an issue? Is this COVID issue affecting the BAME community because of race or because of racism and racial structures that are negative and antithetical towards the progression of particular communities? I mean, the factual stats and the anecdotal analysis kind of supports that. And I'm going to come to Garrick in a minute. If you look in America, you look in places like Chicago, where you have communities who are up to 70% more likely, BME or Black communities, African American, to actually suffer, actually die. It's not even just be diagnosed, but literally die because they've contracted the COVID disease. You've got over here in the UK, the same thing we're seeing, yet we're not seeing that in Africa. We're not seeing that in the Caribbean, which means then it suggests to me, Garrick, that this is not an issue of race, it's an issue of racism and racial structures and people suffering and people not having access to the support systems that they need to actually progress them and to help their health. So talk to us about the medical, is there any evidence that supports, from your understanding, the fact that this thing is affecting BME communities because of their ethnicity, or would you say it is actually to do with the structures?
It is to do with the structures. Right. There's no science that can underline this and then become the given definition. I think that would be totally wrong to say that. So it is structures. It is structures in that individuals of BAME communities tend to work lower paid jobs. And so in a time of social distancing, when they're saying to individuals, work from home, some of these guys are not in those kind of jobs where they can sit at home and work from home. They still have to
and they're on the front line as well, aren't they? They tend to be the essential workers.
Absolutely. Essentially some of the frontline workers. And oftentimes when we're doing this thing, clap for the NHS. I wonder if we take into account those who are cleaning the hospital floors, which some of them are from BAME communities. Those who work in care homes, who are washing the bed linen of those who have been infected with this virus as well and are at potential risk of getting that virus. Those who work in, local shops, supermarkets, serving us, making sure that we eat. They are on the front line and they have to go to work on a day-to-day basis and are at risk of contracting this virus. And naturally, they live in poorer conditions as well, where a lot of family members are grouped together in a very confined space. And if one of those individuals, for whatever reason, have contracted the virus, that's just going to spread like wildfire in that household. And so as a result, the statistics, the figures will go up. Another thing which, and I'm not saying that this is the case across the board, but it's just a personal observation of my own. Yeah. Recently I went to the fish market, and one of the things that struck me was the fact that, you'd walk past a Caucasian person and they'll do their best to maintain the 2 meter or so social distancing. And yet I was going to pass a few Black people and they didn't mind the space at all. They were right in my face. They couldn't care less. And And I saw that not just in that instant, but in other instances as well. I still see people, and they think if I don't shake your hand or if I don't hug you, that's fine. But just speaking alone in close proximity will release enough hair droplets or particles that potentially contains this virus that then will ultimately transmit to other people and they become infected. So there's issues here around how we interact socially, issues around the social disparities that we live in terms of economic disparities and so on and so forth. And there are issues here around the structures of society that means that we are more susceptible as a group of people to become infected by this virus. And it's just the situation. And I think this pandemic in particular is bringing that out clearly. And if anybody before was ignoring the fact that racial structures do exist, I think the evidence is very, very, very clear. And let me make very clear also that there's nothing in the biology of a Black person that makes them different. So this virus can attack them more readily and propagate in their systems more readily. It simply isn't the case.
What about, because staying with you just real quick, and then I'm going to go to questions. In terms of this other theory about vitamin D, which I'm sure you've probably heard about, speak to us about that.
So vitamin D is good for your immune system. I think that's the first point I want to make. And as Black individuals with, highly pigmented skin, we need a lot of that. And that comes from the sun. And if we're not in, temperate climates, that's a harder thing for the sun to get to us. And so, you often take supplements or eat food products that will contain enough of that to boost your immune systems. And what you do find with a lot of Black people is that they're often vitamin D deficient. And yet you take them, you put them in a week in the sun somewhere nice and hot, and then suddenly they spring back to life. I mean, I've seen elders with arthritis, and you put them in the Caribbean for a week, and then suddenly they're springing. There's a spring in their step again. It does boost our immunity, and it does boost our energy levels. And by virtue of it building our immunity, it can become a protective barrier against the virus. It's not the only protection, because if you have a stronger immune system, yes, you will naturally be able to fight the virus off more. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the standard practices and put them into applications such as social distancing, washing your hands, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bishop, I see your hand up, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question for Garrett.
And then I'm going to come back to David with one thing. Go ahead, Bishop.
Yeah, so Garrett, it's a question, but that's my way of saying it's a couple of questions. If you want to answer one of them, that's just fine. Okay. So I want to know what the science is at the moment. Do you have a sense in terms of what you're doing around a couple of things? One, why it tends to be more severe or with men, okay, the difference between men and women. Two, is there any science around why some people appear to have mild or even asymptomatic versus severe or death? Like, is there like a dose you get that makes it, well, like, did you get a bad dose of it, or is it just your body reacting to it to the same dose? Mm-hmm. And then I'd like you to say something about vaccine. I'll tell you why, because back to the conspiracy theory issue, one of the first text messages I got was,
don't take the vaccine.
Do not take any vaccine. It is the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
There will be a microchip in it to control you. So you're working on vaccines. I would like to know if you think that we're close, because of the media seems to suggest that we're close. And what's your thought around the vaccine? And Pastor Mike, I'm sorry if that was too much.
That's one question, Bishop. You've hijacked my questions for part two, Bishop. I've got them written down here for part two. You're running ahead of me, Bish. I was going to piggyback something that you said, though. There was an article talking about the fact that in terms of the vaccine as well, in terms of the vaccine, in terms of the symptoms, that sometimes different races have different types of symptoms. And that was coming out of America, saying that, again, going back to Black and Asian people, that their symptoms may not always look exactly like the symptoms that are manifesting in other races, particularly, and that it's more to do with lethargy, loss of smell, whereas the other races, it can be more flu-like symptoms, as in pains and aches. So I want to piggyback that, seeing as we've got you. Dave, did you have another question to ask Garrick as well? Are we all just piling our questions on Garrick?
Piling on Garrick.
Our doctor. We've got a doctor in the house.
It's not working anymore.
I wanted to raise a couple of other points, but please, I'm more than happy for Dr. Garrick to.
I'm coming to you, Dave, after this, because I want to talk about the inquiry, and then we're going to go to some questions from, seeing as the people are hanging out, we've got 400 and something people here. So as soon as they're hanging out with us, we'll hang out with them. People, if you want us to carry on, people, I need you to, everybody, there's over 400 of you on tonight. You know how it works. I need you to light the page up, okay? I'm a Pentecostal Christian by roots, and we believe in the fire. I need some Pentecostal emojis, okay? So send the fire up if you want us to carry on. Garrick, you ready? I've given you enough time to prepare because Bishop asked you 4 questions. I'm trying to help you out, bro. So good.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop. On to your first point about why this seems to be more severe in men than it is in female. There was one study that came out recently, and it was from a couple of medical experts in New York working in collaboration with experts in India. And what they seem to have suggested, and there's still more research that needs to go, into this just to prove it. What they seem to suggest that in men in particular, the virus tends to travel to their testicles, and it remains there. And the testicles seem to be, it's what we call an immune privileged environment, which means the immune system doesn't go there. It's just one of the few areas in your body where the immune system doesn't go to. So apparently it tends to go and travel there, it waits there, and it can spring back up in their bodies at any particular point. So that makes the challenge much more difficult with men compared to females. And obviously the recovery time will be much longer. So that's
I'm gonna have to stop you there for a minute. And you have to go, because I've never heard that. I've never heard that. Okay. Like, we need somebody tag Sky News or something, because I've never heard this. Ever. It's not great news, but I want you to say it again because it's new news. Go ahead.
And the article itself, it was reported in the Huffington Post recently. And again, as I said, colleagues in New York and India work together. And one of the things that they're suggesting as to why men seem to have more severe symptoms or suffer more severely from this virus compared to females is because the virus tends to travel to their testicles, and it remains there, which is an immune privileged environment. So the immune system can't really go there and fight against the virus. As a result of that, the recovery period seems to be longer. That's just the theory that's being put out there at the moment, and it's further testing to just verify how accurate that is. So that's just one thing that's currently out there. On the issue of different type of symptoms and whether or not you see variations in different racial groups, I think there was a rush, I would say, from the very outset, especially in the news media, to report what the symptoms of COVID were. And initially what you saw was a high temperature or fever with difficulties to breathe and a dry cough. And that's what the media has been pushing for a long period of time, several weeks, in fact. And in fact, we didn't know enough about the virus yet to suggest that those were the only symptoms. And as we began to learn more and know more about this virus, then other things began to be added to the list, such as muscle pain, loss of taste, loss of smell, headaches, lethargy, and a few more things. So as we learn more about this virus, we see other symptoms that are associated with it. Now, I need to make very clear that not everybody who gets this virus will have the same set of symptoms. The symptoms can vary. You can get all the symptoms, or you can only get one of the symptoms. We're not quite sure why that is yet, but it seems to be based on how strong an individual's immune response is to the virus. Now, to say that there are different types of symptoms in blacks and whites, I think that's a bit premature on the basis of the same symptoms that are reported in black are also seen in white people.
Right.
And so I don't think that there's this disparity in terms of symptoms in terms of racial group. On the issue of why some individuals are asymptomatic or why some individuals just seem to die a very severe death. And again, that may be to a number of things, how their body reacts to this virus. So if their immune system is not up to the scratch, things tend to become much more severe. Secondary to that, are there underlying health conditions which have just been exacerbated? So, if you have a heart condition, for example, this thing can lead you into organ failure or heart failure, kidney failure, which is one of the symptoms or one of the things that we've seen coming out in terms of those who have died. So if there are underlying health conditions already, it just seems to exacerbate them. And that's perhaps why we get much more severe symptoms in some individuals. On the issue of actually, let me not jump on too quick. I wrote down viral load. What I mean by viral load, one of the things that a diagnostic lab will look at when they get a sample from an individual is how much virus is in that sample. And we call that the viral load. And if there seems to be an abundance of virus in that sample, that suggests that somehow in that particular host from which that sample was taken, somehow the virus in that person just seemed to have replicated in a very, very augmented way, resulting in a higher viral load, or there's much more viral particles, for example. And if you have more of that in your system, obviously, the consequences of that is going to be a bit more severe. So that's just one particular issue as well. We're not quite sure what it is that really is driving abundant viral replication in certain individuals over others. On the issue of vaccines, yes, there are several centers looking at vaccines in the UK. Imperial is one of them, and Oxford is also one of them. The news has reported recently that Oxford has started a trial. Imperial has also started a trial. And the news media will tell you that, if all goes well, we'll have this by the end of August. In truth, it's probably going to be a bit longer than that. And the reason why it's going to be longer than that is you need to go through several phases to ensure that a vaccine is safe. And what I mean by that is you need to, one, make sure it works, that you find the accurate dose, that you're not going to give somebody one dose and another person another dose. Everybody has to get the same dosage across the board. And on top of that, you need to make sure that people don't have allergic reactions to it. What do I mean by allergic reactions? Normally, when you're making a vaccine, you can do a number of things. You can use a weakened version of the virus. So you can take the virus, you can, do some nice splicing or genetic engineering of its DNA to make it less infectious. And then you can inject that into an individual such that when the immune system sees it, it can fight against it much more readily because the virus is weakened and can't attack like its normal or progenitor self would do. And so as a result, your body produces antibodies, which helps you to fight off this virus. And if you ever see this virus again in the future, your body would have produced what we call memory cells. So as soon as they see this virus again, as soon as it sees this virus again, rather, it will just automatically attack because that memory has been created, that record has been created. The other form of vaccine you can create is sort of like an inactive version. So we said a weakened version, an inactive version of the virus, where you just completely make the virus inactive. It's dead, can't do anything. However, because there are still viral proteins or viral DNA, as soon as you put that into the body, the immune system is going to say, that's foreign to us. We don't know you. So our response is to attack. And in attacking, what you get again is an immune response, which produces antibody. And of course, that helps you for any future challenges with this virus. Now, you have to go through several phases, as I said, to make sure that this is safe, to make sure that there are no side effects, and to make sure that it works. And so it's not going to be a quick few months down the line thing.
Can I say, I'm going to try my best to give you some of the biggest platforms, because the way you've explained things, the insight, the clarity, the practicality, the language that's accessible, I've not heard, I don't know about Bishop or Dave, but I've not heard it like this. This is phenomenal, Garrick, fantastic. And hearing it from a young man who is in your discipline of epidemiology and the infectious disease understanding gives you so much credibility. People, I need you to give him a round of applause just for that monologue. Light the place up for Gary because that was phenomenal. I'm gonna have to. Why don't people like you get platforms, man? Come on. How am I just hearing about you now? What's going on? They need you on ITN. They need you on BBC. I want you on Sky News, Fox News, ABC, DEF, GHI. We need you on everything, man. Thank you so much for that. I think you responded fully, more than comprehensively to the questions. I want to just quickly move on because I promised the people we get some questions in, but I want to just finish with this, with our discussion for now. And if you're happy, gentlemen, you've been so erudite, and it's been fantastic having you on tonight. And if you're up for it, with all this cloud of witnesses, can you all say amen if you're up for a part 2?
Yeah, amen. Yeah, amen.
I didn't hear everybody say amen. I don't know what's going on. Oh, sorry. Okay, cool. Sorry, it's stuck there. Fantastic. Reverend Dave, I want to come to you and talk about the inquiry. There's been this, I think it's Professor Kevin Fenton they're talking about issues with Trevor Phillips and all this kind of stuff that's going on with this inquiry. Tell me about you advise organizations. You've had experience in stuff like this. Tell us how you feel, how confident you feel about the inquiry into the virus and its effect on BAME.
Well, I mean, all you have to do, again, I'm going to be a bit more critical maybe. You just have to look at all the inquiries that have happened. The only one that's really made any substantive difference in terms of the way life changes for Black people in the UK has been the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And that was really a transaction between the Black community and Jack Straw. If you vote for us, we'll give you this inquiry. And that's how that came about. It was a straightforward transaction. Get us in, and this is your reward for getting us in. You look at Scarman report and all those other reports. We don't see. You look at Grenfell. You're not really seeing too much come out of that. You would have thought that'd be a straight, clear cut. So honestly, for me, I don't really have that much confidence. Yeah. This is where the prophetic comes in, and relate it back to. I loved what I could listen to Dr. Garrick all night and loved it. A couple of things that struck me. We talk about immune deficiency. Lots of doctors are saying excessive fear, social aggression, microaggressions that you experience on a day-to-day basis can induce fear and lower your immune system. Structural racism. The first 10 doctors that died were from BAME communities. 17 doctors have died. 16 of them are Black or BAME. That's we can be washing our hands and we can be social distancing, but we need to be writing down some facts. And asking some critical questions. Are all those doctors immune deficient? Are all those doctors? I mean, you talk about this. At the moment, we're not getting enough PPE for the NHS. There's a story in the Bible like that. In the book of Exodus, what happened? The Hebrews are supposed to build bricks without what? Without straw. No PPE equipment. What do we learn in Genesis chapter 4? That when there's a death that shouldn't happen, God interrogates it. Cain kills Abel. God doesn't say, I turned a blind eye because he was having a bad day. God says, actually, no. Your blood calls out from the ground. So we need to start to adopt a prophetic perspective now. That actually there are people who are dying unnecessarily, people whose deaths should have been prevented, but because of the systemic racism within this culture, these people are dying. That begins to shape a prophetic mandate for the church to say when this inquiry is set up, we need to have some questions asked, because those questions are fundamental questions to our community, because this is not just about exclusion and isolation or even quarantining ourselves. This is now about the cessation of life for disproportionate numbers of our community. And if we don't get vexed about that, we might as well go out and start teething and drinking like everybody else.
I hear you, Dave. I hear you. Bishop, I want you to, as I get ready to announce some, put out some questions, what should Christians be thinking about right now? What should they be doing in terms of, number one, engaging with the community in terms of representing Christ well? What should churches be doing right now? And I know you and I have had lots of discussion. Me and you, part of Reverend David, had lots of discussion on stuff like this, but just speak into it a little bit. What your thoughts are right now?
Well, certainly I think that churches have an opportunity to serve each other, to share, to practice Christianity in a very authentic way with our members and with members of our community. Now, sort of relocating from a physical space to cyberspace and using telephones and operating within the confines of quarantine has been enough of a challenge, and many of us are still getting to grips with that. But at all times, loving our neighbors ourselves is pretty much the mandate for the church. I do think that what Reverend David has made reference to is it's very important that church leaders become part of that particular conversation and lend weight to the questions, so the questions are not coming from isolated individuals. I think if there ever was a time that we needed to be collectively asking, why are these deaths happening, and what are we going to do about the racial structures that have been exposed that are detrimental to our people? I think we have to fight for our people. I think that's very, very important. If you are a Black majority church or any leader, this is a question that must be asked with force. Mm-hmm. And we must lend our force to that. But at the same time, we have to be ministering to people that are suffering, not just physically, but mentally. It is a mental health crisis. It is an economic crisis. And there are so many casualties of the crisis. There's so much fallout. And I think that Christianity thrives against a particular backdrop. I think the exponential growth of the early church wasn't just due to prayer and fasting and evangelism. There was a social economic context that actually allowed the message and the method of the disciples to resonate with society. And I think right now, our message and certainly our methods can resonate with people who are desperately needing hope.
Thank you so much, Bishop. A couple of questions are coming at you guys. So number one, we've got kind of questions that are kind of similar, some of them. So I'm going to try and merge some of them a little bit. One question is on conspiracy. Can I ask the panel what they think of a vaccine, the topic of a vaccine linked to a tracker to identify who has taken the vaccine? So we'll pose that to you, Garrick, and we'll merge that with the still kind of connected to the vaccine a little bit, where Bishop, somebody's asking about what you meant by being injected with the mark of the beast. Bishop was being facetious, number one. He was just, being sarcastic a little bit. But the point is there is a conspiracy out there. You could go, Bishop, go.
Yeah, no. Someone sent me a text very early on, like a week into the whole thing, and said the vaccine is the mark of the beast. And of course, I rejected the idea because I'm a bit of a theologian, not quite a theologian on some people's levels, but I did.
You're a theologian, Bishop. Let's
spend many years studying biblical eschatology, and particularly the end times. And I think that your eschatology needs to sit within your broader Christology, and that actually you have to decide by what we are saved. We're saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. If that can be reversed by accidentally or ignorantly taking an injection, then actually this undermines the very basis of salvation and faith. So I completely rejected that idea entirely. I think I'm going to pause it right there with answering about the vaccine issue. I said it because I'd heard it.
Exactly. Yeah,
in terms of the erosion of privacy and civil liberty, that is another conversation that's part of the prophetic mandate that Reverend David is talking about. I think we really do have some hard conversations to have, and we need to be able to speak collectively with one voice around that, because we have seen what temporary measures tend to pan out as. Temporary measures typically last lifetimes and generations. And power once gained is not easily given back. So we would have very serious questions about that.
When we do our part two, Bishop is the most, in my opinion, and right here, it's my life, so it's my opinion that probably counts for most right now. But Bishop is the foremost mind when it comes to eschatology, and so we're going to climb into some of that as well. Yeah, probably in the part two. But Garrick, talk to us about this issue of another one of the guest conspiracies in terms of the vaccine. Go ahead. Because you're just once again, those of you who've just joined us, if you've just joined us, I need you to like and share this video, because I think it's going to bless so many people. We've tried to be as candid as possible tonight. It's three preachers, a doctor. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, but it's not. It's been so insightful. And Garrick is working, he's a scientist and he's working with one of the foremost research hospitals looking for the vaccine, searching for the vaccine, and has a discipline in understanding infectious diseases. So speak about that vaccine issue right now. Talk about a little bit more about the development of the vaccine.
So to develop a vaccine, you need that infectious sample. So you can get a sample from a patient. And what you need to do, you need to be able to somehow expand the number of viral particles in that sample. So if there is a set number in there, to get a vaccine, you need some way to expand it. There are a number of ways we can do that. We can grow that in the lab. Once you've grown that, you can purify it. And once you've purified that, then that now gives you your basis of developing a vaccine that you can then mass produce and begin to test. In testing a vaccine, what you need are healthy individuals. So you need to challenge healthy individuals with the vaccine. And what you want to do over a course of months or days or weeks is to take blood samples from them just to see how well that vaccine is working. And the way you do that is basically to check for antibody levels. The level of antibodies will tell you exactly how effective this vaccine is working in individuals. So that's just sort of the process on it. In terms of what you said about a potential tracker or tracking device in the vaccine, I realize there's been so much polarity in terms of the discussions that have been taking place in society, the conspiracy theories, etc. It is, so I want to say on balance, it is totally possible to put a tracker into a vaccine. So I'll say that on balance so that we can all just come to the same table and have a conversation here. That is completely possible. However, what I was also say is in terms of the colleagues that I know, there is no instruction from government to put a tracker in the vaccine, certainly not that I've heard of anyway. And secondly to that, I don't think in all what is ethical and what is right and what is morally good, that the individuals that I know would participate in something like that. And also, yes, Bishop, I'll let you in.
Would you tell us if they did?
That's good, bro. Come on, man. What's this? You can't put the man on the spot like that.
So we can join forces with Reverend David and march.
Garrick, don't let Bishop bully you, Garrick. Don't let him bully you.
You ask a very good question, and who knows how one will respond in a situation like that. But let's cross that bridge if we ever get to that bridge. And so there is no plan at the moment that I know of for anybody to put a tracker in a vaccine. And I would also have to ask, what would be the need or the requirement for that tracker?
Yeah.
What would be its purpose be? And maybe the suggestion here would be that they would know who's taken the vaccine and who hasn't taken the vaccine. That's civil liberties being infringed on. We're in a democratic state, and there is nobody who's going to be forced to take the vaccine. We don't need 100% of the population to take the vaccine. We just need a threshold, and that is enough to create what we call herd immunity, which means that the majority of the people in the population will be immune against this virus, and therefore, even if it infects a few individuals, it won't spread and cause the chaos and the crisis that we're currently seeing.
Listen, guys, this has been the longest live I've ever done. Okay, my lives are notorious for being long, but this is exceptionally long, which means I'm going to try and bring it to a close, and then we're going to do a part 2. Garrick, I make a commitment to you, if the Lord allows me to live, I'm dedicated to giving you a platform during this thing, because I don't know where you've been. It don't make no sense to me. You just appeared like a Highlander from nowhere, and you're carrying this level of insight, information, revelation, and credibility. So I'm going to be pushing you, man. I'm going to be you're coming. I'm going to have to talk to your pastor and ask him if you can come talk at the tab about some stuff. But we're going to push you. We're going to push you, man, because you've been great tonight. I'm so glad to have had you come on. And this has been phenomenal. Bishop is always a complete, mind-blowing individual when it comes to having conversation. And Reverend David and Bishop know that when we all get together, when I get together with David, sometimes we plan to meet for an hour and a half, and it ends up being 4 hours. When I meet with Bishop, when we start talking, Bishop, how long does that go on for? Lord have mercy, it's ridiculous. So we want to do this again. If you've been blessed by this, everybody, I need you to just light the page up again as a sign of an applause to the guys we've had on tonight. My goal, people, has been to try and bring knowledge. I know I could do the preachy thing. We could just climb into Bible all day long, or I could bring on big preachers and we just have preachery conversations, but that's dead as far as I'm concerned, because what people need is practical information. People perish for lack of knowledge, and that's what Wisdom Wednesdays at this moment are really about, bringing practical knowledge and insight that will hopefully give you encouragement, give you information, which I tell you, I've been blessed tonight. And, you know, it's not all the time I have people on that, you know, challenge my mind, but this has been phenomenal. There are some guests, it's an alpha and omega moment, the first and the last time. But with these people, this is going to have to go on to a part 2, guys. So I love you, everybody. Listen, don't forget Sunday morning, the Tab at Home service, Tab at Home online. Come check us out. Those of you, if it's your first time on our Facebook Live, look through the history on this page, Mike White Pastor, and there's another public page I have called Mike White London, and you'll see other lives with other individuals that will bring wisdom into your life concerning marriage during quarantine, mental health, and finances as well. As we're seeing this whole furloughing thing kicking off, this is important for us to recognize we need to utilize this time so that by the end of this season, we don't come out just fatter, we come out further, economically, intellectually, and spiritually. So let's make sure we make the use of this time. Know that Pastor Mike White loves you. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you to the most noble bishop, Bishop Wayne Malcolm. I need you all to make sure you buy some of his stuff, his books and stuff. Reverend David Shosanya, get everything. Every time you hear Reverend David is on the itinerary to speak somewhere, get there. Don't miss your church on a Sunday. But any other time, get there, okay? Yeah. Get to wherever Reverend David is speaking. He is a mind-blowing speaker. And I'm just glad that Bishop and David have been friends of mine for a long, long time. I feel privileged to have a relationship with you guys. And to our new friend, Reverend Dr. Garrick Wilson, thank you so. Garrick, I have to say something. You do look 12, okay? You look young, man. You look young. All this wisdom and knowledge coming. How old are you, brother?
You put me on the spot now. So.
I know, but it's my life, so I can do that.
I'm not involved with this game right now, Garrick.
Garrick, are you married, Garrick?
I'm not married, and I know you're.
Well, there you go. There you go. He's a single doctor. What's going on, guys? I love you, brother. Forgive me.
Myself and Reverend David were not part of this.
Forgive me. I repent. You're a Christian, Garrick. You got to forgive me. You have to. It's part of our theology, okay?
Always forgiven, sir.
Love you, brother. You've been phenomenal. We're going to get you exposed as much as possible. I'm going to make some phone calls tomorrow and see if we can push you out there, because I think the information you're carrying, and it's not just information, you know, it's information and articulation. How you put it across is accessible. And I think that's what people need, because a lot of that would squash a lot of the nonsense that's out there, because people grab on to what they understand, and sometimes what they understand actually is obviously not truth. And so we've heard truth tonight. Love you, everybody. Have a great evening. Get some sleep. Some of you traveling tonight from the front room to the bedroom. That's about it. That's as far as the traveling goes. So love you guys. Have a great evening. Pastor Mike White signing out. Thank you so much for your time tonight. And look out for part 2. And I'll try and bring some other guests on as well as we go along. God bless you.
Bless you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
That's it.